Well, unfortunately, my mic isn't working. Just can you give me a quick thumbs up if you can hear me? All right. Well, this debate is discussing the issue of, believe it or not, World War II. We're discussing whether the United States should have nuked Japan. I'm taking the proposition that nuking Japan was an immoral act, and there was 3 reasons for this. First, we have to understand that when the United States decided to nuke Japan, they didn't do it once, they did it twice. And twice, they targeted 95% civilians. That's like saying, okay, the army is a little bit more difficult to attack, so let's go attack the families of the army because they're a little bit more vulnerable. Second, the second argument is that there's a misnomer about how the victors that write the rules or write the history books say we must have nuked because it would have ended the war. Well, that turns out to be untrue. There's 5 out of 6 generals at the time during World War II were all against nuking it because there was an inevitable defeat of Japan. And lastly, if any other country did this to anybody else, they would be tried for war crimes. And we wouldn't have devoted billions, if not trillions of dollars dedicated to creating weapons of destruction that have misallocated resources from productive goods towards non-productive destruction. And that's my opening.
Alrighty, well, I just want to thank you for starting off the round. And I will say that the first thing that our judges should be voting for in this sort of debate round is utilitarianism. That's the first thing that they should value. So voter issue, I want you to prefer rural utilitarianism, and rural utilitarians adopt a 2-part view that stresses the importance of moral rules. According to rural utilitarians, a specific action is morally justified if it conforms to a justified moral rule, and a moral rule is justified if its inclusion into our moral code would create more utility than other possible rules. According to this perspective, we should judge the morality of individual actions by reference to general moral rules, and we should judge particular moral rules by seeing whether their acceptance into our moral code would produce more well-being than other possible rules. Well-being, as for the definition of this debate term, should be defined as the hedonistic value of what brings more happiness and what brings more well-being within a certain sphere of people, rather than what brings more pain. Also, so after we address the rural utilitarianism bit, so the first 3 reasons, to go through it very summarily, I'm going to provide evidence in my next rebuttal. The U.S. nuked Japan twice, targeted 95% of civilians. There is evidence to back up that the Japanese people sort of, I don't know what the specific word for it is, but were willing to fight to the death. In evidence that I'll read later, there was a 28 million army militia that was prepared to defend the mainland of Japan. Not only that, but the number 2 would have ended the war. To respond to that argument very briefly, I would say that this was a concrete way to end the war, and the reason that this was a concrete way to end the war was because the front in Burma at the time was also owned by the Japanese, and the Indo-British, I believe, 4th Regiment inflicted about, I believe, in between 125,000 and 185,000 casualties, and so showed no signs of abating, and the Russians were about to come onto the front of Manchuria. And to respond to the third and final point, if any other country had done this, there would have been moral reparations. We have no other proof that any other country would use such a thing. I would ask the judges to throw that out, really, because that's purely a hypothetical. But with that, I'll pass the mic.
Just one before I can. The purpose of a debate is to not ask the judges to throw out the other person's arguments. I know that wasn't your focus, but it's like, all right, judges, before we continue, let's dismiss his other 2 points. And then we go forward. All right, but there is 2 points that you mentioned that we need to kind of discover, kind of divulge a little bit further. One, you mentioned Russia. That is true. Russia was entering the fray, where entering the North Pacific, going in to get attack China from the north. I mean, sorry, to attack from China in the north, which put Japan in a two-front situation. All the more reason that you didn't have the necessity to nuke them immediately, because Russia, believe it or not, was an ally of the United States during World War II, and putting them in a two-front situation made surrender more inevitable. Second is the utilitarian argument, where we shouldn't be able to judge the moral outrage of a certain circumstance based on the situation of what would have been the best outcome if we could have chosen X or Y. Basically, the means justify the ends type of an argument. I just object to this only simply for the fact that if you were a player that was, born in Japan, you're 5 years old, your family, you're living with your friends, and then, a nuke comes down and destroys your neighborhood, all your friends, your family, and there doesn't seem to be a purpose from doing that, because the people that were being attacked weren't the people fighting. Which leads me to your third point. The culture of the Japanese warrior. The victors who wrote the history book have propagated the fact that we had to nuke them because they were just so difficult. They would never give up any ground when we were fighting them. So the best thing we could do was to attack their families and attack all the innocent people on the homeland. We didn't attack any military targets because we know they're going to hold their ground. So instead, we went and attacked all the civilians that had nothing to do with the war, because then we would break their backs. It's kind of like that quote that Trump did in the debate. Well, it's like, why aren't we torturing the families of these terrorists? Wouldn't that get them to stop? Maybe it would, but I think it's the wrong thing to do, and I don't think that America should be doing that. However, if we remove the ethnocentrism lens, I want you to address the utilitarian point. Are you saying means justifies the ends?
I'm 100% saying that the ends justify the means, and that the judges should vote on a utilitarian-based framework, that bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war and it reduced casualties. So when the Central Pacific Offensive began, I'm using this evidence. This is from the book Modern Times, the text by Paul Johnson. When the Central Pacific Offensive toll in November 1943, the Americans had to kill all but 17 of the 5,000 garrison for the fact that they wouldn't surrender, and lost 1,000 men themselves. At the next island, Kwajalein, virtually all of the 8,500 defenders had to be killed. On Leyte, the Japanese lost all but 5,000 of their 70,000 men, and Americans suffered 3,500 deaths. At Iwo Jima, the Americans sustained the worst casualty ratio, 4,917 dead over 18,000 Japanese. And in taking Okinawa, they suffered 12,520 dead Americans, and Japanese losses of 185,000. Even in Burma, the Indo-British 14th Army, that's what I sort of wrongly quoted in the first round. The Indo-British 14th Army killed 128,000 Japanese. Even before the dropping of the A-bombs, Japanese figures showed that raids on 69 areas had destroyed 2,250,000 billions, made 9 million people homeless, killed 260,000 people, and injured 412,000. The emperor had been told the war that could not be won as early as February 1942. And in 1943, the Navy had reached the conclusion that defeat was inevitable. In 1944, Tojo had been thrown out by a Navy putsch. But none of this made any difference because the fear of assassination that the emperor faced was too great. On June 6th, the Japanese Supreme Council approved a document, the fundamental policy to be followed henceforth of the conduct of war, which asserted, "We shall prosecute the war until the bitter end." They had no intention of stopping the fighting. Even this response to your argument that Japan entered a two-front situation, they had no intention of stopping. The final plan for defense of Japan itself, Operation Decision, provided for 10,000 suicide planes, 53 infantry divisions, and 25 brigades. 2,350,000 trained troops would fight on the beaches, backed by 4 million Navy, 4 million Army and Navy civil employees, and a civil militia of 28 million people. They were to have weapons that included muzzle loaders, bamboo spears, and bows and arrows. Special legislation was passed by the upper form of their Congress, the Diet, to form this army. Also, to address the propaganda said by the Allies that the Japanese were savages, cannibalism of Allied prisoners was authorized when other food was not available. So I would actually argue that it's not propaganda, that this is actually a historical fact that some members of the Japanese army did commit acts of cannibalism, which is a savage act. And with that, I'll pass the mic.
In terms of the propaganda, I'm not addressing if there was cannibalism or something like that. I've actually never heard of that. I was addressing that the idea that the culture of Japan led to the fact that the soldiers were more willing to give their lives rather than to give ground or retreat or surrender. However, if you look at the generals that were actually fighting these battles, most of them actually concurred that there was one thing that was unsaid, because you generally don't go against you don't go against your military once the commander-in-chief makes a decision. However, Dwight D. Eisenhower, you might know him because he was kind of a five-star general during World War II, said that there was other generals besides me, but we questioned the cogency or reasons for the wisdom of such an act, referring to an atomic bomb. And conscious of a feeling of depression, so he's in his memoirs, he decided to kind of give his voices misgravings and saying that Japan was on the verge of defeat. The fact that they picked when they dropped the atomic bomb did nothing but add insult to injury. Well, that comes from the general of that was kind of fighting the battles on the ground, and he thinks that dropping the atomic bomb added nothing but insult to injury. It kind of adds to the question. Well, I thought the history books all said that all the generals agreed. In fact, if you the recitations that you just put out when you actually named the amount of tanks, the amount of planes, the amount of manpower that they still had, and it's like, right. So instead of actually attacking that manpower, they still had that manpower after we nuked them. All that military presence was still there. We just attacked the civilians of the country. And I just want to address the fact that that's an immoral act, and the United States should not engage in immoral acts. There was 425,000 people that died in the weeks following the atomic bomb or during the atomic bomb. That doesn't include the countless generations that suffered the consequences of the radiation poisoning that the atomic bombs left in its wake. We have generations of Japanese citizens who are unable to reproduce, and you can see that there's a population problem that Japan is still suffering from today. So, and if you summarize it in a simple manner, I think the winners that write history are trying to say we needed to do the bombing so the war would end. Evidence at the time from the generals that were on the ground don't agree. Russia came into a two-front war.
All right, so I'll pick up back where I left off. So to question the moral cogency and the efficacy of bombing, we had dropped some 720,000 leaflets warning that the city would be obliterated, the city of Hiroshima. We were warning that the city had been obliterated, had been dropped 2 days before. So 2 days before the bombing, we had warned everyone the city would be obliterated. 720,000 leaflets. There's no possible way that these people would not have seen this. Not only that, of the 245,000 people in the city, 100,000 died that day and about 100,000 subsequently. So we have 200,000, but basically the entire city leveled. 245,000 people died that day. Compared with the civilian militia of 28 million people, the trained army of 2 million people, the fact that we had destroyed 2,250,000 buildings and made 9 million homeless, if this war had continued, there would be more refugees than the 9 million that had already been made homeless. There would be more dead. There would be more destruction. And to show for it, we would have lost more American lives. So to go to the population, the innocent population, the risk outweighs. So what I want the judge to vote for here is that the risk of more life lost is outweighed by a ground war. Also, going into other evidence here, Brian Klingner is a senior research fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation. He previously served 20 years at the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency, including as CIA's deputy division chief for North Korea. Given the tenacity of Japanese defense and high civilian fatalities during the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa, it is likely that the Allied invasion of Japan would have caused millions of Japanese casualties. In addition, that there are estimates that 100,000 to 250,000 non-combatants in occupied Asia would have died for every month the war was extended. From anywhere from 100 to 250,000 people would have died every month the war extended. There was also reports that Japanese commanders had orders to execute all 400,000 Allied POWs if an invasion of the Japanese homeland ever occurred, which further outweighs the case of the 200,000 people in Hiroshima. Had the Pacific War been extended, the Soviet Union would have likely invaded the northern and occupied the northern half of Japan, making it communist, which would have led to other problems. Any student of life in the Soviet Union and occupied Eastern Europe knows how brutal life would be for anyone living in Soviet-occupied Japan. These two events, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were tragic, but the impact of invading the homeland outweighs the impact of dropping the bomb. And with that, I'll pass the mic.
Okay. You got an interesting analysis from our fellow. So I'm going to go to the Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. He was the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet that fought Japan, and he said, quote, "The Japanese had, in fact, already sued for peace. The atomic bomb played no decisive part from a purely military point of view in the defeat of Japan." Fleet Admiral William D. Leahy, the chief staff to the President Truman, said the use of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender because of the effectiveness of the sea blockade and the successful bombing with conventional weapons. The lethal possibilities of the atomic warfare in the future are frightening. End quote. Now, those are the generals that fought the war, that were on the ground, that saw those potential consequences that you're alluding to. They don't agree with you. They didn't see these consequences. These consequences are hypothetical, and they're written by the people that, written by the victors that wrote the history books. We have to basically justify the fact that we justify our acts after the fact. Obviously, we're not going to commit try our own people for war crimes. We're not in the position to do so. Instead, what we will do is we will say, all right, guys, we have a tactic. We're fighting a military with a bunch of people with military weapons. If you have the moral decision at any point in time to say we have a nuclear bomb, should we target military targets or should we target a metropolitan city with 95% civilians? The moral decision to drop the atomic bomb, even where they did, was a wrong action in terms of moral consequences on a personal level, whatever moral context that you're living in. You can go all the way back to ancient Rome. You do not attack civilians and retain the moral high ground. The consequences of doing this has had trillions of dollars spent on these nuclear weapons that can now blow up the world 10 times over. Now, the amount of resources that were spent into researching and developing these weapons could have been better allocated towards productive resources in the economy that could have been reallocated towards productive measures such as medical research, maybe finding the cure for cancer. How about trying to help the homeless? I mean, just any moral deed that you could have taken those trillions of dollars over time that we used to justify the fact that we used the bomb in the first place. Now, if that was turned around and you say if a country did that to us, what we have said.
Okay. So to start beginning to sort of address what's going on here in the debate, the two main arguments that are happening here is no material assistance. The no material assistance argument is basically that American generals said that we didn't need the assistance and we can't hold the moral high ground. I'm not claiming to hold the moral high ground. That's not what the utilitarian argument is about. The utilitarian argument is about what benefits more lives is the most just thing to do. I don't care for holding the moral high ground, quite frankly. Like, what I care for is what saved the most lives. And it's clear with the preponderance of the evidence of a 28 million person militia that would have perished because they were using bows and arrows and bamboo spears in defense of the mainland. Not only that, but you also have a 400,000 Allied POWs that would have been murdered had the mainland been invaded. We haven't really given any other, we haven't been given, in the course of this debate, we haven't been given any other alternatives to invading the mainland. So I want the judges to prefer that as an example. Also, no material assistance. While that's true, while the American generals said those things, we still have in Paul Johnson's The Modern Times here, the literal document that was passed by the Japanese Supreme Council, the fundamental policy to be followed henceforth in the conduct of war, which asserted, we shall prosecute the war until the bitter end. The Japanese generals had no intention of stopping. So despite whether or not American generals thought that we needed this, the Japanese would never have stopped fighting. Also, to substantiate that claim, I have an article from The Atlantic here written by Carl T. Compton. Carl T. Compton was one of the men who helped develop the nuclear weapons, and he interviews a Japanese soldier. And the Japanese soldier says, we would have kept on fighting until all Japanese were killed, but we would not have been defeated. In a sense, is my opponent correct in saying the Japanese were beaten? Yes. They had no path, no vantage point forward with which to win the war. However, my opponent is wrong in the sense that Japan is defeated as in they would stop fighting. They would have never stopped fighting. Also, to respond to the sort of the nuclear weapons that were created claim, VX1 nerve gas that currently exists today is far more deadly than nuclear weapons. A drop of VX1 nerve gas touches your skin and you will literally drop dead. So we could go down I-64 right now. I could have a fertilizer truck full of XV1 nerve gas, release the mechanism on the fertilizing truck's pump out a gallon or so of that, and kill 15,000 people on the road. So
Okay, so just a quick question. I've cited 3 admirals on the United States side that have just to make sure that we're on the same page. I cited 3 admirals, right, that all said that not only was it not a material assistance, that the defeat of Japan was actually not only inevitable, there was actually already word that the emperor was going to send an envoy to Moscow to ask for a surrender. Now, this is from generals. Who was this anonymous Japanese soldier that said we would have never stopped fighting if you didn't bomb all the civilians on our homeland? Just a quick question and come back to me if you like.
So in the article, it cites about a week after VJ Day I was one of small group of scientists and engineers interrogating an intelligent, well-informed Japanese officer in Yokohama. It doesn't cite specifically who the officer is, but that's what it cites. I'll pass the mic back.
Well, that's my point. There's like that. Most of these people are anonymous sources. They're anonymous Japanese soldiers. My point was that most of these sources don't come from anywhere. The people that were actually on the ground, that all saw it as an unnecessary act. And not only that, that was the first bomb was an unnecessary act. The second bomb was an immoral act. It was unnecessary, it was cruel, and it served no purpose other than to break the backs of the people that lived in the country, not the soldiers, the people that lived in the country. Now, we're looking at a utilitarian argument where the means justify the ends or the ends justify the means. I'm saying that if you make decisions and you have the decision between to attack people that are killing you and to attack a bunch of innocent civilians, I'm saying that 100% of the time it is wrong to target the civilians by justifying it with, well, the soldiers would stop fighting if we bomb the civilians. So it's not only is it incorrect that it ended the war, it's also irrelevant to the moral argument that it's always wrong to target civilians but guess what? One of these days, when the civilians on your side, you're going to be pretty outraged. I don't think you're going to want to stop fighting if they bomb the civilians. I think you're going to want to pick up a gun and take arms against them. Now, if the Japanese weren't already defeated militarily, that would have occurred. Instead, what we saw was basically insult to injury, and that's why bombing was wrong in this circumstance. And the utilitarian argument is all based on hypotheticals that can't be proven. If we didn't do this, they would have never stopped fighting. I have an anonymous Japanese soldier. Well, I have 4 generals that say defeat was inevitable. And I'm not, I know it's, I hate when people address the judges. So I'm trying to actually talk to Ian here. And so, but judges, audience, people that are interested, I want to make sure that you know that the U.S. generals think that defeat was inevitable, not anonymous Japanese soldiers.
Okay, so yes, the American admirals thought that that defeat was inevitable. But again, I'm going to go back to cite the Japanese Supreme Council issued an edict that said we will prosecute this war to the bitter end. The leadership of the country said that they would never stop fighting to the bitter end. Not only that, but we had a 28 million person manned militia. 28 million. You can't sort of assume that civilians are innocent or not culpable of a sort of war if 28 million civilian militia is willing to aid the war effort. Not only that, but again, the utilitarian framework isn't sort of concretely answered. The framework of hedonism isn't really concretely answered. We're saying that it's immoral to bomb a vast amount of civilians. For what reason? Because they're civilians? Like that has no uniqueness to the war effort at all. We've firebombed prior to this. We had firebombed multiple cities. We had destroyed 2,250,000 homes, created 9 million refugees, but there was no moral outrage there. Not only that, but with 9 million refugees in the country of Japan, we somehow did not have the war effort to stop. If not only the Japanese government, but the Japanese civilians were willing to keep a government installed that would continue despite 9 million displaced refugees, it was clear that they had no care for the lives of their citizens. The fact of the matter here is, when we look at war, all war is inhuman. Some of the comparisons of the atomic bombing with conventional bombing. At Hiroshima, the atomic bomb killed 80,000 people, pulverized 5 square miles, and wrecked an additional 10 square miles of the city, with decreasing damage out to 7 or 8 miles from the center. At Nagasaki, the fatal casualties were around 45,000, and the area wrecked was considerably smaller at Hiroshima. Compare this with the 2 results of B-29 incendiary raids over Tokyo. One of these raids killed 125,000 people, and the other nearly 100,000. So we have here instances of firebombing that killed just as many civilians. So we really have no uniqueness to the claim that somehow nuking was bad because it killed more civilians. So what I want the judges to sort of vote on at the end of the day is saving more lives is net beneficial and is net better towards the judge's vote, rather than holding up some moral high ground and virtue signaling when it would have cost more lives. Saving more lives in the end is more valuable. And that'll be the end.
There's no evidence that it would have saved more lives. You have individual soldiers anonymously saying that they if you didn't nuke us. It seems again a little bit odd, because all the people on the ground said they were all surrendering. There was Emperor already sent word to surrender to Moscow. Already sent a convoy to Moscow to issue a surrender. I mean, it was already happened. It's just a moot point. I'm not trying to virtue signal here. But it's hard to say the people that live in the country by virtue of existing, right, not attacking anybody, they are part of the military, or by not removing the government. Well, I guess then the same thing could be said about the United States at any point in time, which I don't disagree with. It's just the problem with that is the people that are born there did not choose to be born there. They were innocent. They never killed anybody. They never attacked anybody. They never gave arms to anybody. They never even wanted to be in that war in the first place. They were just born there. And being born there is not. There was not justification to saying, well, you're supporting the government because you seem to exist, so we're going to bomb you specifically. Second, this is not solely focused on nukes. Just the proposition stated nukes. The firebombing was very similar. However, this proposition focused on nukes. I'm not saying one was better than the other. Any attack directed at civilians is always an immoral act. Just for the very sad fact that it's not self-defense, you can't argue it's self-defense, and you can't even argue in the long term that it's going to give you the moral high ground. And I want to say that was a great debate.